Hi, everybody. Good evening. Today is Wednesday, June 17th, 2020, and welcome to Evoke Therapy Program's broadcast. The title for tonight's broadcast is Narcissism and the Narcissistic Wound. And just like in our previous broadcast, I'm going to talk about this in a way that I hope brings it really close to home for all of you. I think this is one of those terms, ideas that I think we know a lot about. It gets thrown around in pop culture a lot, and I think there can be some wisdom in connecting to it and understanding how it connects to all of us. I didn't write this for my slides this evening, but I was just thinking about this, about how developmentally speaking, everybody goes through a dramatically narcissistic phase in childhood, right? That's part of being a child, is to be self-centered, to not see other as other, to imagine that everything revolves around you. And so it's developmentally appropriate and expected that we all grow through it. Now, the more wounded we are, the more we develop this particular pattern of defenses, the more it becomes a problem and a diagnosis, of course. And just like I talked about last week, I want to give you a spoiler as we set out. Having been raised by human parents with limited resources, all of us, we all have some narcissistic wounding, and we all have some narcissism. Because this is one of those diagnoses that is paired with so much derision. In fact, we use it in our everyday language at times as an insult, right? There's a lot of sensitivity around mental health and mental illness these days, but this is one of those words, one of those diagnoses that seems exempt from it. But if it is true, like all mental illness issues, it derives from wounding. It derives from pain, from trauma. And instead of thinking of it as a character flaw, which I think a lot of people think about it as a conscious decision, as a conscious character flaw or shortcoming, it really is something that requires healing. So I'm going to talk tonight about some things that maybe aren't intuitive, or at least not popular in our culture, and hopefully get in and dip into some deeper things. There are two primary courses to take when we encounter someone who seems so different or much more depraved than us. First, we find out what is common between us. We find it because we have the courage to look deeply inside of ourselves and realize there are fewer differences than we had imagined, or maybe even that we had hoped. The second course, of course, is to turn the other person into a monster. This requires very little capacity. We turn our hurt, our injuries, our fear into anger and hate. This is what we do in our society. It's a trauma response. It's a response that protects us. This is a passage out of my book, The Audacity to Be You. It makes us feel safe. It preserves the idea, this second course, that we are good. We are not the bad one. But here's the dangerous rub: is we can do this bad object thing, this projecting onto others our horrible, rotten parts, or our parts that are unhealed, unwelcomed, unknown to us. We can project those onto those people that we care most about. And children are the most likely targets of our projection. We think of them as the problem. We think of them as the cause of our pain, of our turmoil, of our lack of serenity. So tonight we're going to talk about this idea of integration, of pulling it back in. Melanie Klein, a famous psychologist and contributor, one of the primary contributors to Object Relations, talked about these two positions that we hold in life as children. She talks about the paranoid position. The paranoid position is that the badness is out there. The enemy is out there. The threat is out there. You can simply think of it in terms of the identified patient. I think I've shared this before, but when we did an analysis, when we got to 500,000 listens on our podcast, we did an analysis of the most listened to podcast, the most who was doing the most listening, where they were listening, and I was disappointed to find that the two most popular podcasts by a long way were the Identified Patient 1 and the Identified Patient 2, just two that I had done on the same subject many months apart. And while this isn't a scientific conclusion, I wondered about this idea of, I wonder if that's an indication of our inclination to make the problem external to us. It's very easy for us to talk about the spouse, the co-parent, or the ex-spouse as the problem. Many people, in fact, I hear this so often. My ex-spouse is a narcissist. After tonight, I hope you come to realize that everybody has some of it, and there's a continuum. But at any rate, there's lots of books about parents being narcissists and spouses and men being narcissists. But people will come to me and say, my ex-spouse is a narcissist or my co-parent is a narcissist. And I always say to them at some point, that's an interesting idea. But what's more interesting to me is what's your dance with them? Why would you have been, they probably didn't develop this overnight. It was probably, like is true for most people during courtship, it was probably invisible to you. Why was it invisible to you? And of course, the most common reason why it would be invisible to you is because you were swimming in the same waters prior to that. I was telling a client recently, I was talking about this idea of being listened to, and he was complaining about the fact that his wife, his sisters, his parents didn't listen to him. And when he was sharing this with me, he was saying, I don't get heard anywhere except for, of course, he mentioned in this hour that I talk with you. And I said to him a few moments later, I said, the same is true for me. While my wife can do some of it, and I try to find friends and my people that can listen, it's a pretty uncommon experience to be truly and deeply heard. But what I do with that 1 hour a week with my therapist, I realized it at this moment, at the moment that he was sharing, is I take that 1 hour a week, and for me, it's been for the last 21 years. I take that 1 hour a week and I compare it to every other interaction that I have. That becomes the standard, the reference point, the bar, if you will. And how short people fall from that expectation, that bar, gives me a sense of their mental health. Now, people's mental health vacillate throughout the day, so it's not like a static point. There are times when I act like a depraved idiot, and so does my wife. But overall, the pattern starts to be clear. We start to recognize mental illness and mental health. But first, we have to have some reference point. So one of the reasons why you might not have recognized it during courtship or when you join a partnership, even in business, is that you had very little exposure to the opposite, to mental health. The paranoid position, looking for others to be the solution, right? In therapy, in family therapy and couples therapy, there's this theme, there's this constant theme of people coming to therapy thinking, if you could just fix my idiot spouse, if you could just fix my idiot child. They don't say those words, of course, but you can feel it in the presentation. I know I've thought that for many years with my wife. If you could just fix her insanity, our marriage would be wonderful. But the problem is, when the solution is outside of us, it's also outside of our control, and that's a very terrifying place for it to be. We suffer more from anxiety, anger, rage, and depression. Then Melanie Klein talks about the depressed position, this second position that some people never fully arrive at, which is an integrated position. A recognition that how I'm living my life might be the cause of my distress. My relationship to the identified patient and their symptoms, my relationship to them and that might be the cause of my distress. My relationship to my ex-partner, my co-parent, might be the cause of my distress. And by relationship, it means it starts off from where I sit. Then it extends to my dance, my interaction with that person and with their issues. Thich Nhat Hanh, the Buddhist monk, says there is the possibility of peace in every step. He's saying that peace is available to us, even in trying and painful circumstances. But we have to go through a transformation of consciousness to get there. And that's part of what this work with parents is about. It's about really, while your children are safe and while we're doing what we can with them, for those of you that are in our program, many of you are not, of course, but it's about taking this time to say, how can we shift in our relationship? First, as it relates to our children and their struggles, but then to everybody. Can we find freedom without their changing? This idea that the problem is in me is synonymous with mental health. It's empowering. It doesn't mean that you're the cause of their problems, although as you work and do your work, you see your contribution, right? But it's not a simple cause and effect about that your behavior, your way of being causes certain things in a very simplistic way in your child, but it's that you're the cause of your own problems. That's the shift. That's the integration. That's the development. There are two forms of depression, of narcissism. There's more than one, but there are the two main ones. The most common one is the grandiose form. We're all familiar with the grandiose form. This kind of arrogant, can't take any feedback, can't apologize. A narcissist can't listen. They can't admit fault. I'll talk about the diagnostic criteria in just a moment more specifically, but we're familiar with that type of narcissism, the grandiose type. But there's also a depressed type, which looks much more like somebody that looks helpless, powerless. Some people might call them a victim, that victim mentality. That person, when they walk into a room and somebody's off in the corner chuckling, they'll assume it's about them. When something goes wrong, it's about them. You see, everything still comes back to them, not in a positive way, in a very painful and ultimately depressed way of coping. But it is a narcissistic feature. Codependency. The idea as parents that our that fixing us will fix them, that it's a simple cause and effect, the intense guilt and shame that many of us struggle and suffer through, that's a depressed kind of narcissism. That's a shame-laden self-centeredness, if you will. Again, coming from a wounded place, coming from poor modeling, coming from not knowing other. Let's talk simply about the diagnosis and the diagnostic criteria of narcissistic personality disorder. I basically summarize this from the diagnostic manual that we all use. Narcissistic personality disorder, or NPD, taken from the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, the DSM-5, is the following criteria. You have to have 5 or more of these criteria to fit the clinical level of NPD. A grandiose sense of self-importance, preoccupied with fantasies about success, power, brilliance, beauty, or ideal love. Believes he or she is special and unique and can only be understood by others with those qualities. Requires excessive admiration. Has a sense of entitlement. Is interpersonally exploitive. Takes advantage of others to achieve their goals. Lacks empathy and is unwilling to recognize others' feelings and needs. Is often envious of others and believes others are envious of them. Shows arrogant, haughty behaviors and attitudes. Of course, this one is speaking about the grandiose form. That's what the diagnostic manual talks about. But clinicians and clinical theory talk more about the depressed type. but it looks like arrogance. It looks well defended. But as I talk about the narcissistic wound and where it comes from and how to heal it, I think we'll find a different kind of perspective and compassion. And ultimately, what I hope this broadcast can do for you is give you some peace and serenity, allow you to respond to narcissists with more compassion and patience, taking it less personally, if you will. What is the narcissistic wound? Different than the narcissistic injury, which is when somebody taps into our narcissistic wound by their behavior. But essentially, narcissistic wounding in childhood is the wound of not being seen and having the experience that the authentic or real self was not tolerated. Now, the crazy thing about this is it can look like excessive praise and adoration of a child. The router had to reset. So I'll try to start from where I left off. I think I was saying that it can look like praise or adoration, but the key is that the individual, their real and whole and authentic self isn't seen. Right? To be adored for how fast we run, how smart we are, how beautiful we are, how well we play tennis, is to not really be seen. To be really seen, that means that all of us gets to be tolerated. Don't hear tolerance as a lack of boundaries. It just means psychologically speaking, it gets met with compassion and understanding. So essentially, that's the piece that makes the difference, is to be seen, to have all of us seen. So that's the narcissistic wound, is not being seen. It occurs when parents are compromised, maybe unavailable, could be because of time, being overworked, stressed, lack of psychological resources for the child. That can mean they're psychologically compromised, or it could just mean that they're just compromised, not even from a psychological sense. Their psychological compromise could be in the form of diagnoses, including narcissism, which, by the way, as is part of my explanation tonight, everybody suffers from some narcissism. So if that's true, that means it includes our parents. We all have some of this. It's just a matter of gradation. It's a matter of the quantity, where we fit on the scale. This is my favorite part of the broadcast, some of these ideas, because narcissism is one of those words that's thrown around so often. It doesn't come from overindulgence. That's one of the accusations I hear, is that kids today are developing this entitlement, or this kind of extended period of narcissism, meaning that it's beyond the developmental norm, because they're being indulged. It doesn't come from indulgence, although that might be a signal. That might be a part of the equation, but that's not the primary piece. It doesn't come from permissiveness, although that might be a signal or a symptom. The parent is often anxious. And so while many of us think, or have even been taught, or even the culture teaches, that anxiety is kind of this love gone too far, it's really a lack of self. That's the fundamental piece of it. The building block for guarding against narcissism in children is the parents themselves having a well-developed sense. I want to be clear about this, because this is important. A superiority complex always covers up an inferiority complex. A superiority complex always covers up an inferiority complex. And so people will respond with, well, that person doesn't seem to be lacking a sense of self. That person seems quite full of themselves, actually. That's just the symptom. That's just the exterior. Integrated whole people, they show up as imperfect. They can apologize. They admit fault easily and effortlessly. They laugh at themselves. The joke can be on them. They can own mistakes and problems and fault and contribution. So anxiety is this often present in the developing narcissism. Parents are usually well-intended. With the parents that I've worked with, and I know there are others, but with the parents that I've worked with in my career, virtually every single one of them would have been described by their peers, by the people around them, as well-intended. Maybe not their children, but everybody else. Meaning that they look more like you and I, you and me. They look more like us than they do what we might imagine, the monsters that we might imagine. But there becomes this link in the family between worth, value, and accomplishments. It's like Midas. That's what the myth of Midas is about. That the thing that makes it valuable in the myth of Midas is its financial worth, the gold. Everything he touched turns to gold. Right? It's a myth about creating narcissism. It's a myth about a narcissistic orientation. And ultimately what happens for Midas is he's unable to connect to the humanity in others because of this, what was thought to be a gift, a blessing. And at the core of narcissistic wounding, of narcissism itself, is just a terrifying emptiness. And the more well-developed the disorder or the defense, the darker and more terrifying the emptiness. How we hold children and others in our mind makes a big difference. It's not what we do to them. See, the indulgence and the permissiveness, it's a signal because it shows in many ways a lack of self in the parent, right? They're often looking for a sense of themselves in the reflection of their children's faces. They're looking for something from their children that they should have gotten from their parents. They're looking for approval or adoration or acceptance or agreement or validation. And what bothers me so much in our field is as difficult as that can be to say about a parent, really what it evokes for me is compassion. Because the parent that looks for validation from the child is just wounded. They're just injured. They're just traumatized by some attachment fractures or wounds. So this narcissistic wounding, this narcissism itself, these are attachment fractures. The wound itself is an attachment fracture or a trauma. The disorder is born out of attachment fractures. Narcissism is a mask for emptiness, dread, and fear. And for many narcissists, it will result in a really powerful existential crisis and depression. This is for me, the kicker of kickers. And that is this: cutting them down to size. Like, what are most people inclined to do when they encounter a narcissist, a typical narcissist, a grandiose narcissist? Most of us, and I raise my hand along with that group that I'm identifying, most of us want to cut them down to size. Most of us want to point out to them how they're not all that. They're not as great as they imagine or are broadcasting. And while that might be instinctual, it's not helpful in the long run. And the earlier we can get to it, the easier it is to treat. But it is treatable in later life if there's just some motivation on the part of the narcissist. And oftentimes it does look like existential crisis or depression. Right? They start to experience overtly the openness that's underneath. This is from a blog that I wrote about the myth of narcissism. What really is narcissism? A blog that I wrote. Narcissism is not the result of being overvalued. Instead, narcissism is the result of valuing the wrong thing in the child or valuing the child in the wrong way. To put it another way, the child is not valued. Technically, it might be impossible to overvalue a child, but we can value them for the wrong reasons, such as valuing them for being good or being the easy or the happy child. Many children experience praise and adoration for their accomplishments or giftedness, and they interpret that as love. It's experienced as affection and connection. In the recent Academy Award-winning movie Inside Out, the main character was referred to by her parents as our happy little girl. After several disheartening events in her life, the young girl experienced and displayed sad and morose emotions. Subsequently, due to a lack of empathic capacity, her parents interpreted this as disrespect rather than a valid emotional response given the circumstances. She had violated the idea of being the good and the happy child, and there was no place for that. It was too threatening to the parents because of their own narcissistic wounding. When we are valued for such things as our talents, our intelligence, our obedience, or our happiness, essentially we are not seen by others. In the drama of The Gifted Child, Alice Miller talked about the need to cut the connection between being admired and being loved. And I love this quote because I think it sums it up so well. Without therapy, she suggests, it is impossible for the grandiose person to cut the tragic link between admiration and love. If you can just relate to this just a little, if you could just relate to the link that all of us have just a little, the link between being admired and being loved, you understand narcissism. You understand the narcissistic wound. J.D. Gill says it this way: of course, the good kid is never the real kid either. The only real kid is the whole kid. Good parts, bad parts, and those in between. See, there's this idea that true self-esteem means never needing to be validated. It's not true. We wouldn't be human if that were true. Our strength is in groups, families, communities. But the key is we must have validated all of us. I tell the therapist, hold a little bit lightly, hold just a little bit lightly a client's success in therapy. Don't get too excited about it. Because what they will read into that is that if they don't progress, then you'll be disappointed. And you're really just re-injuring them. You're doing what we would call good abuse. And good abuse can never cure bad abuse. And so we replace it with curiosity. For one is free of this tragic link that I described only when self-esteem is based on the authenticity of one's own feelings and not on the possession of certain qualities. I adapted this from the drama of The Gifted Child. When we find people who can see us, who can sit with us patiently, non-anxiously, curiously in our struggles, our pain, our idiocy, our faults, our limitations, our bad self, when that can be tolerated, we heal. And we experience it as an unspeakable love and grace. And you know what happens when you experience it? You just want to give it to everybody else all the time. The grandiose person, Alice Miller says, is never really free. First, because he's excessively dependent on admiration from others, and second, because his self-respect is dependent on qualities, functions, and achievements that can suddenly fail. You start to see the tenuousness of this disorder, how it's organized in such a way to protect from that dark, cold nothingness inside. We have to mourn the loss. We have to mourn the old self. We have to grieve the narcissistic wound. And this is for all of us, right? Everybody has some narcissistic wounding. You're human. It can't be otherwise. Some less than others, some much more than others, but we all have some. And we grieve what wasn't given to us, what wasn't present. I love what Alice Miller says. She says, this experience is not a homecoming, since this home has never before existed. It is the creation of home. I see this in my adult clients over the years. They start to experience something, and they'll even use the words home. And I've used this quote. I say, but it feels like what home should have been. As we grow up and do this work, this goes for you all that have children that might be struggling. You start to see things that were previously invisible to you, that are ubiquitous, that are everywhere, all over the place. The child must adapt to ensure the illusion of love, care, and kindness, but the adult does not need this illusion to survive, right? As we grow into being an adult with a capital A, we lose this need to be good, to be good. The narcissistic wound creates the need to be good. And as we grow in our mental health, as we evolve, it's such a liberating moment. It's probably a series of moments, because it's probably never fully completed for most anybody. But those moments when we just give up being good, we surrender. And what we replace it with is just being ourselves. Somebody asked me, sent a question in through our website asking me, how do I, with a difficult child, and they describe the circumstances, how do I embrace this idea that you talk about being good at losing when the stakes are so high? And I said, it's not about the choices that you make. It's not about the effort that you make. It's about recognizing, number one, what's inside of your control and what's not. But number two, it's about being good. The need to be good is really at the core, really the strongest signal or symptom. It's what is at the heart of all of our fights with our spouses, our disagreements with our co-parents and our children. It really is mixed into all of those things, those dynamics. Perhaps the greatest of wounds is not to have been loved just as one truly was. And we have to mourn that loss. My father passed away of COVID-19 actually earlier this year. And he and I were estranged for many years prior to this. And I suspected that this was going to happen when he passed. I did talk to him before he passed, and told him that I loved him and that I would be okay. And we had a nice discussion of closure. But what really came up for me was the retouching upon the grief of the thing that I never had from him. The father that I never had, and that now that he was passing, he passed away the next morning after I talked to him. The realization that it was never going to be possible, even though I'd intellectually given up on it years ago, and in many ways emotionally had, just that last unconscious hope was gone. That's the grief. That's part of what we talk about when we tell your children, when we tell children, we say, yes, your parents dented you. Parents don't get away with not denting and bruising their children. But now the dent is yours. The bruise is yours. You must grieve it. You must explore it, get to know it. Explore its landscape, understand it. I love this quote from Alice Miller. All of these are from Alice Miller. We then realize that all of our lives we have feared and struggled to ward off something that cannot really happen any longer. It has already happened at the very beginning of our lives when we were completely dependent. So many of the things that we are trying to stop from happening already happened. They already happened. We were not seen or abandoned or turned into the bad object. I shared this recently. I think I've shared this before. In fact, on one of my broadcasts here, I shared this on social media. Most parents, I said, gaslight their children on a consistent basis. Regretfully, I say, I have done it more than I would like to admit. And yes, it is a symptom of parental narcissism. Right? I want to talk my children out of their feelings because their feelings point back at me and I have to be good. So how can I be the source of their pain or distress? That's my narcissistic wound. I can't be bad. I can't face the nameless dread, the emptiness. So I try to talk them out. I try to make them feel crazy or irrational. I tell them they're overreacting. They're being too sensitive. They're being selfish. They're blaming. They're playing the victim. Right? I have all of these things at my disposal to make them the problem because I can't have it in here. When I posted this on social media, I got a lot of objections. And it took a while for me just to settle into the fact that I was just getting all of these defenses, the defense from people. Somebody said, only narcissists do this. We like to create a safe distance between us and the disturbed. The badness must be out there. We don't want to have anything to do with narcissists. We want them to be an entirely different animal altogether. You see, racism is not new, and it's not relegated to even the last 500 years or 600 years. Racism is the result of creating an other, an enemy, a scapegoat. And we don't have to do it on a macro scale like this country has done. We can do it on a micro scale in our own family or our own relationships. I see it all the time. My ex-spouse is a monster. My co-parent is a monster. Okay. But that's not the most fascinating part of the story. The more interesting part of the story is why did you partner up with them and what can you do now? What's within your control? I also have a tremendous amount of empathy because I complained, not about my wife, but about a particular person in my life, in my professional life, for years. And my therapist diagnosed them over and over again with narcissism. And what she was suggesting without saying is, what are you going to do? Yes, this person is clearly clinically narcissistic. And I was devastated by the constant wounds and by every attempt I was making year after year after year to try to avoid it. But in the end, I had to do something different. I had to get out at some cost. People told me when I posted that on social media that it's that gaslighting is a conscious manipulation. You know, that's what a layperson would think. And maybe at the most severe or sociopathic end of things, it can be conscious. But narcissists and sociopaths, for that matter, are wounded people. It doesn't mean we have to not treat them with any rules or regulations or laws. It just means we don't need to project all of our badness and evil into them to be okay. Psychologists will talk about this idea of pseudo-stupidity. The idea of pseudo-stupidity is that our not knowing all of this is not really an intellectual deficit. It is an emotional limitation. The defense I was getting from people was coming from an emotional place. Someone said most parents, and the research does suggest that most parents are around somewhere between 56 and 60% are securely attached, and thus are able to provide the child with a securely attached response, not gaslighting. And at first I thought, well, maybe it's just a bias because I'm dealing with parents in treatment. But then I thought about it. I remember years ago I was sitting at an IHOP with my children. And this father with his 2 or 3 children in the next booth, this father was gaslighting this 10-year-old, 12-year-old like crazy. I see it in the non-clinical population all over the place. You'll see it too. And as you see it, hopefully you'll do it less. But you can tell from this broadcast, it comes from a deep place. A deep place of self, of growth, of substance, of okayness, of esteem. And then, of course, I got that someone suggested that I was just trying to exonerate children or others from their accountability, which, of course, isn't true. In fact, somebody just wrote a review of my book, The Journey of the Heroic Parent. I saw the other day on Amazon, a couple months ago, actually. And they said, it sounds like they gave me 1 star. And they said, it looks like this book was just written to exonerate parents of all of their faults. And I was thinking to myself, I don't know how somebody could read something so opposite of my intention. We don't look back at our childhood to stay stuck and to blame. We look back to move, to grieve. Adapted from the drama of The Gifted Child, I wrote, the therapist may cloak his disapproval and derision behind abstract terms like borderline, obsessive regression, destructive, but unless he explores the 3-year-old boy inside of himself, he will not see the parallel between these terms and garden variety contempt. The same can be true of parents. Our projection of our bad self onto and into other people is a defense. It doesn't mean that there aren't people out there that are compromised and doing very hurtful, harmful things to other people. That's true. But to become obsessed with, that's really what it feels like to me. To become obsessed with their badness is to distract oneself from one's own project. I was obsessed with my colleague. Obsessed. I would plan conversations and retorts for hours. I would try to find ways to be good and to please them. And that obsession was a sign of my unhealed narcissism coming out in the relationship with this narcissist. I won't go in depth with this particular slide that I put up here about the secure attachment. This is the antidote, right? Secure attachment looks like, the response from the other looks like, thanks for telling me, tell me more. I appreciate knowing, glad you told me, thanks, that sounds hard. I'm sorry, I'm here, I'm listening, and so on. And of course, what it doesn't sound like is gaslighting, which is, that's silly, irrational, unreasonable, stupid, ridiculous. You're overreacting, too sensitive, you're being selfish. You should. Ignore them. Look on the bright side. That's just your depression, your ADHD, your twisted thinking, your anxiety, your narcissism talking. What are the take-homes? Like everything else, narcissism is a continuum, and you're on it. We all are. And the freedom comes when you own it, when you look at it, when you see it, when you grieve and move through it, not by denying it or not seeing it. And it's your wound to heal. However it is, and it's there to a greater or lesser extent, however it is that you weren't seen, left a mark, and it's yours now. It's your responsibility. And so you do, in this way of thinking, you do the work of self, becoming you. All of you. The work is not a betrayal of your parents or a blame of your parents. It's an acknowledgement of the reality of existence. It's just seeing what is. And if you need another motivation besides the freedom and the peace that come out of this work, it's a great model of accountability for your children. Your narcissistic wounds have wounded your children. And even in the most counterintuitive ways, I talk about this in the first book, that enmeshment or over-identification is perhaps the most serious form of abandonment, because in enmeshment or in over-identification, somewhat synonymous, in that dynamic, something is lost altogether, and that is the reality of the other. When two become one, essentially it's abandonment. So the work is deep and profound, and it takes years. And this isn't about techniques or tools or skills or a set of 5 or 6 or 10 or 20 steps for you to take to fix your kid. This is the invitation. The kids being evoked is just the invitation into your work. They're just the signal that something in your life, by extension, needs attention. They're simply asking for you in ways that they could never articulate, because it's not anywhere near conscious, for something different than what you had growing up. And you can do a little bit of the work. You can shift it a little bit to the left or to the right. And then they can do the same. So it's not a simple cause and effect, but it's a dance. And there's no shame or blame in it. But although it might be comfortable to go around pointing out all the borderline and narcissistic people in the world, doesn't do much for them, doesn't do much good for them, and it definitely doesn't do much good for us. To keep a safe distance between us and the disturbed people doesn't really help us at all. Feels comfortable, but doesn't really make a difference in our life. The subtitle from The Audacity to Be You: Learn to love your horrible, rotten self. Right? That's the idea. And you know what? All of you is okay. It's beautiful. It's even the broken parts, the dark parts, the parts that act out, that are immature, the parts of you that are hurtful to others. There's still a beauty and a simplicity in it, because if you trace it back, you're just tracing it back to the injured child inside of you, your history, the unhealed you. And how can that be unattractive? How can that be bad? As I've grown older, I've become more able to be honest with myself and with others about who I am and what I do, especially when I do something hurtful or wrong or stupid or I make a mistake. Because at the end of the day, it just comes because I'm compromised. And that's not shirking responsibility or abdication. It's just owning it. And in owning it, for me, that implies that I have a lot of work to do, which is why I'm not done with therapy myself. I'm happy to take any live questions or comments, if there are any. Somebody wrote, Is it possible to heal attachment fractures in our children? We try to create competing experiences from those earlier experiences. So yes, a little bit at a time. Think about it as as creating competing experiences for your children. Same thing I do in therapy as a therapist. Same thing we do at Evoke. Yes, you can make a difference. You can contribute to the healing for sure. It's not a simple one-time automatic reversal. It is, and it's not a conscious intellectual shift, because all of the awareness intellectually in the world doesn't undo the deep, deep experience and wiring that's held in the body and the unconscious parts of the brain, the pre-verbal, non-verbal parts of the brain. So it's an experience. They need to re-experience themselves in a safer context, which most importantly, the best case scenario would be the newer version of you, the evolving, healing version of you. We can do it. We can make a difference. A teacher, a coach can make a difference. But if you can do it, it has the biggest impact. Someone says, is it likely that the grandiose person is capable of risking therapy? It's hard. It usually has to come from some kind of crisis or deflation or failure. Sometimes it happens when a child needs mental health treatment or addiction treatment, right? You all know that. Sometimes it happens when your child struggles. Sometimes it happens after your second divorce. Sometimes it happens after you get fired for the 5th time. Sometimes it can just happen in a crisis moment of existential angst when somebody gets sick or dies or you get sick. So usually there has to be some precipitating crisis for them to risk therapy, to go into it. It's like a manic, if you know what bipolar or manic behavior is. Oftentimes the manic person doesn't want therapy. Someone said, while in treatment, my son confided that he never really felt the praise and consequences, that it all felt the same. I still do not understand how us making sure he knew we were proud of him could feel the same as disappointment. Can I assume this comes from not being seen? That's such a courageous question. I love that he said that. The fact that he said that is such a cool insight. It feels the same because who are you, mom and dad? You know, I say this all the time. I don't live my life to please my mother. We don't even have the same values. We don't subscribe to the same political ideals. It's not your job to tell him who to be. It's not your job to engineer or shape him up and who you think he needs to be. And so your opinion of him is actually rather unimportant and feels hollow. It's your job to be you and to love him and to have boundaries, right? Being you means having boundaries, limits. So when you become people, when I say this, I have many people tell me years later they went crazy when I first said this. People think that the goal of a parent is to shape a kid up and to tell a kid right from wrong and to tell a kid how to be. That's not the recipe of raising a moral child, moral person. It sounds like it. On a conscious level, it would make sense to us. It's about attachment. That's the thing. And attachment takes a self in the form of a parent. So your son, that's an incredible insight. I think he's saying is, I don't want to live my life for you. And I'm realizing, or I've realized, if it's past tense, that it all is cheap and unimportant to me. And I don't care if you're proud or disappointed. It's not my job to make you proud. And it's not my burden that you're disappointed. It's my job to grow up to be the real self, to be who I am, which is full of light and love. So thank you for that. That's a great, tell your child, that's a great, great awareness to have, without saying it in too much of a praise kind of way. How do children heal the wounds of a narcissistic parent who doesn't recognize that they are a narcissist and is hurting their child through their anger? Sometimes you have to leave. You have to grow up. It's hard. It's your job. It's your life's work. It's my life's work. So that's what it is. Just the job of being a person, being a self. And it takes a lifetime. And if you're the non-offending parent and your co-parent or your ex-spouse is quote unquote the offending parent, just do your work and stay on your side of the street and be a listener when you can. Be as nurturing and capable as you can of listening to the child without inserting your agenda, your pain into the equation. And know that it's your child's burden to bear. And it's going to be their life's work. It's all of our life's work. What if being all of you makes everyone else around you uncomfortable? Well, I can think of some people in history where that was the case. And thank heavens for those people. Right? If those people in history that you and I can think of were interested in making everybody else feel comfortable, the world would not be as great as it is today. So people being uncomfortable about you it's not necessarily an indication that you're doing something wrong. It's just something to be curious about. I never thought of two becoming one as being abandonment. Please talk about the correlation between abandonment issues and narcissism. Is it high? Of course. Narcissistic wounding in a parent, narcissism in a parent. And again, we're all in that continuum. We're trying to heal and get from our children what we couldn't get from our parents. And in that way, the needs of the child become invisible to us. We make decisions based on our needs. That's why I always tell you, this is the last question for this evening. That's why I always tell you, go and get your needs taken care of over here at a group with a therapist, with a mentor, with a sponsor, with a trusted friend. So when you come back to the child, the interaction serves to support them and what they need. So yes, any form of narcissism is going to contribute to the neglect of a child and perpetuate this narcissistic wounding. All right, folks, if you want to find out more about your own narcissistic wounding and healing, this is the place to do it. Our intensives are also online right now. We have a Finding You coming up this month in person. We're taking special safety precautions, including everybody being tested the day before. We have some tests approved by the FDA that everybody can be tested the day before, including the staff. Finding You 2 I'm running one on July 15th through 19th. We have one on August 6th through 8th online. And the Finding You online 2.5 days, we just added one to the schedule. So we had July 6th and 8th already up. July 29th and 30th through 31st is now up. August 12th through 15th and September 23rd through 25th. It's the most passionate recommendation I can make to all of you if you want to do deeper work. For more information or to register, contact malia@evoketherapy.com. For parent support groups, if you want to participate in a discussion, we have Zoom parent support groups, June 18th, July 2nd, and July 9th. Intensive support groups for if you're an alumni of our intensive program. The next one will be July 14th. All of these are via Zoom. Contact malia@evoketherapy.com for more information. We ask all current parents to go to some combination, 6 groups, some combination 6 times of Al-Anon, CODA, Families Anonymous, or AdultChildren.org. You can also go to Refuge Recovery or NAMI.org to get other resources in your local area. All of these broadcasts are available on the podcast app. Search your favorite podcast app, Finding You at Evoke Therapy Podcast. You can also go to soundcloud.com to find them there. On Twitter and Instagram, you can find us by using the handle @Evoke Therapy, or an intensives program on Instagram by using the handle @Evoke Therapy Intensives. On Facebook, you can search us Evoke Therapy Programs or the Foundation by searching Evoke Family Foundation. The Evoke Therapy blog has new content. Both of my books, The Journey of the Heroic Parent and The Audacity to Be You, Learning to Love Your Horrible Rotten Self, are available on Amazon. I know some people don't like to use Amazon because it's part of the problem. Unfortunately, for some of us, that's the only place that we can make sure that our books are sold. So if I have access to other places to sell them, I would, but some of the small folks won't sell books. So consider that when boycotting Amazon, you're also boycotting the small author like myself. I'm going to take 2 weeks off. I finally get 2 weeks off. We're going to do a family trip, practice social distancing the whole time. I will be back Monday, July 6th at 7 p.m. and I'm going to be talking about coming out and talking about sex and gender. So thank you for joining us this evening. I hope this is a helpful point of contact. Sorry for the disruption when my power went out. I hope it's not too disruptive, and maybe, Malia, we can get some special permission to kind of splice those two things together. The podcast will be out tomorrow and it'll be all in one piece. So take care, folks. Have a great evening. Talk to you next time. Bye-bye.